We've got to realize this is just about a ceasefire at the moment, a 30-day ceasefire, which sure can be extended, and they hope that it'll be used as a basis for proper peace talks to actually settle the thing. But at the moment, it's just about that. Now, Putin has raised all kinds of questions, which he said need to be painstakingly analysed. And to a degree, that's a delaying tactic. The point is, though, now, once he actually gets to talk to Trump, I think this is the point where he has to put up or shut up. Either he's going to have to accept the ceasefire, maybe with some additional clauses and deals thrown in, or else if he continues to hesitate, if he continues to say, well, here are 7 more points we need to address or whatever, then essentially he's signaling that actually he's not interested, but that he doesn't dare to actually turn around to Donald Trump and say no. So I think, if nothing else, we may not know what's going to happen going into this conversation, but coming out of it, we should have a lot greater clarity. Anything can be achieved when you are authoritarian leaders, whether we're talking about Trump or Putin. It would mean Putin basically having to just basically set aside a lot of his concerns, because there's a lot of nuts and bolts about the ceasefire. Who gets to monitor it? Exactly where do you draw the line? Trump, again, I don't think really is on top of all the detail, the minutiae. That's not really his thing. But you might say, if Putin is willing to essentially more or less say, everyone just ground in place, and essentially it's just a question of just stopping firing, and wherever the troops are, the troops stay, which will probably mean some Ukrainian troops are sitting still on Russian territory, then absolutely this can be achieved. Dealing with Trump is always a sort of a complex art. And I know that going into the previous phone conversation between Putin and Trump, there were some people within the presidential administration in Moscow who were worried that Putin would actually overplay his hand and possibly alienate Trump. As it was, he seemed to have played it pitch perfect. He knows that right balance of sort of we are men of the world amity and outright flattery that gets you places with Trump. So it's a question of whether basically he can repeat that particular triumph, because what he tends to do is exactly he flatters Trump, and he more or less frames Trump in that kind of, as you know, this is necessary for peace, to try and get Trump to sort of be brought along by him. So, it very much depends on how on top of his form as a shameless flatterer and Trump whisperer, Putin turns out to be in that conversation. So there's a lot riding on it. Whatever additional talks they make, Trump has talked about maybe, talking about land and power plants and that kind of thing. None of that really instantly becomes fact. I mean, it's all very well Trump saying, "Oh, the Russians can keep this," or whatever else, but the Ukrainians will have a say, just as to a much lesser extent the Europeans will have at least a bit of a say, because this is not the end to it. It's not actually as if at the end of this conversation they'll have sorted everything out. All they can do is, in a way, give the broad parameters, and then that's when you get the respective foreign services, the experts, the discussions, all the less exciting side of things. Again, the sort of thing that Trump isn't really interested in getting involved with. So yes, I mean, if out of this phone conversation, we get the sense that as far as Trump is concerned, he and Putin can just divide everything between them and sort it out, that will be worrying for the Ukrainians. But as I say, there's going to be a lot of detail work between the phone call and any final agreement, and the Ukrainians will have their chance to make sure that their interests are heard there. But when it comes down to it, ultimately, Trump clearly wants to end this war, and he's willing to see the Russians left in control of, well, basically at the moment, they have about a fifth of all of Ukraine under their control. Probably as far as he's concerned, he's happy to write that territory off. Zelensky says he's not, absolutely not willing to do that. We'll just have to see if he can hold the line.
Макрон высокомерно говорит о том, что ему не нужно разрешение России, что Украина, что уже смешно, суверенное государство. Так размещай где хочешь, мы убьем вас всех. Мы убьем вас всех.
Solovyov's job is to make barking mad threats and pronouncements, so that, by contrast, the Kremlin and Putin look like the moderate statesmen. So, I think there is a danger in looking at the detail of what he says. I mean, he has at times also said that Russia should launch a nuclear weapon against Britain or a nuclear weapon into the sea so that a tsunami will sweep Britain away. I mean, we have to remember that as far as the Russian ultranationalists are concerned, Britain is in many ways the architect of most of their problems. They think that we all but run Kiev and that we have been behind so many of their misadventures. It's always nice to know someone thinks we really do matter in the world still. But on the other hand, I think it is true that the Russians are not at all willing to accept the idea of British and French peacekeepers. And to a degree, it's hard not to think that a lot of this discussion that Emmanuel Macron and Sir Keir Starmer have been having is a kind of fantasy football of geopolitics. It's coming up with an imaginary team that's never actually going to play on the field. Because when it comes down to it, the Russians aren't going to accept it. But more to the point, they're also saying that they will rely on, they will need the Americans to provide what they call a backstop. In other words, for the Americans to be willing to support them. And Trump hasn't given any indications that he's willing to see that. So in those circumstances, by all means, they can have their discussions, but it's hard to imagine there are going to be these peacekeepers in Ukraine. You've got to understand that any of these kind of forces, they are essentially there as a deterrent. And deterrence, it's not just about what military muscle you have. It's about what the other side thinks you're willing to do. From Russia's point of view, does he honestly think that if push came to shove, Britain, France, and whoever else joins this coalition of the willing would actually go to war with Russia over Ukraine? I mean, we haven't the last 3 years, we haven't been willing to send troops or anything like that. And so even if, in fact, British and French troops would fight if they were there when Russians came over the border again, by that point, it's too late. The point about deterrence is to deter, it's to stop Putin from trying it in the first place. He doesn't really rate, he rates the British and to a lesser extent the French as serious countries. But generally speaking, these kind of coalitions and the Europeans as a whole, if they haven't got the Americans backing them up, he doesn't really take them that seriously. And that's one of the other reasons why, in fact, this coalition of the willing looks as if it wouldn't really perform how it's meant to, which is, in other words, to stop the Russians breaking any further agreements. We must remember, after all, that before the Ukrainians sort of pushed their idea of a ceasefire to basically stop long-range drone attacks, they launched an unprecedented series of drone attacks on Moscow, which killed 3 civilians. In some ways, you turn the screws right at the point when you actually want to make a deal, because you really want to illustrate to Kyiv that, look, whatever Trump says, you better agree to it as you've said you would. Otherwise, this is what is going to kind of be awaiting you every night thereafter. So, I mean, yes, of course, let's not pretend that Putin is in any way really interested in peace. He's just simply interested maybe in sort of a pragmatic end to a war that has spun out of control compared to what he imagined it was going to be in the first place. But the point is that launching drone attacks now is really just a part of a kind of a vicious form of negotiation.